Hey guys, it's Cody at BDS. Today we're going to go over the install on our 6.5-inch lift system on this 2021 GMC 2500 AT4. All right, now that we've got our wheels off and the truck up in the air, our first step is going to be taking out your torsion key bolts. All right, now that you've got your bolts out, you need to take the adjuster out. You might need a tool like this to push up on your torsion key, but in our case, this one is loose, so you just push up on it, and then your adjuster slides right out. All right, now that you've got your adjuster out, you can slide the bar forward. You might have to wiggle it, and then your key will come right out. If you're doing this on an older vehicle, it might be rusted in here, and you might have to hammer on the back side of it. There's access hole right here where you can get to it. So now to get your torsion bars out, I like to remove this cross member, and there's just two bolts, one there and one there, and the nuts are welded on the back side, so you don't have to worry about that. This is a 21mm socket. Now you can pull out your torsion bars. Make sure your assistant stands and doesn't help at all. All right, your next step is you're going to remove your factory skid plates. That is a 15mm socket. All right, and you're going to want to save all your hardware and your skid plates because these are going to go back on later. So now we're going to disconnect our sway bar links. It's an 18mm wrench. And you're just going to disconnect the lower. You don't have to disconnect the upper at this time. So now we're going to grab our 21mm socket. We're going to take our tie rod nut off. And you might have to grab a hammer and tap on the side and then up top to dislodge your tie rod. So now we're going to disconnect our ABS line. Helps if you have a trim tool. Get that out. And then it's got this little red safety clip here. You have to push that back. And then you can squeeze it and slide the two apart. So now grab your 10mm and you can take off your bolt here and your bolt here, and then one final one here for your ABS line. You're going to want to be careful with this not to break it because they are fairly expensive. And after I get the bolts out, I like to put them back in the bracket so that way you don't lose them. As you can see, there's already a little bit of rust on there, so on an older truck these might get stuck. You can get some pliers on the sides of this and just wiggle it back and forth. Just once again, be very careful with it. And then you'll just grab your trim tool again and get these two Christmas tree clips out. Now we can unbolt our other two 10mm bolts to take our brake line bracket off the knuckle. So now we're going to take our bolts out for our caliper. They are a 21mm socket. Once you get your caliper off, you're going to want to hang it up on the frame. We have these hooks. If you don't have these hooks, you could also use a zip tie. Just kind of fish it through one of these holes, just so you don't have a bunch of slack on your brake line. You don't want the caliper hanging from that. And this has 4 bolts on the back side. And just make sure you got slack on your brake line. So now you can grab your T30 and take out your bolt for your rotor. And I like to take that bolt and put it back in the hub. That way you don't lose it. So now we're going to take this dust cap off. I like to use a chisel, just a hammer. You can kind of get in the seam there. Just work it around in a few different spots. Now you can grab your 36mm socket and take off your hub nut. make sure to save this for later. So now we're on to the hub bolts. You can either take them out now, but as you can see, the socket doesn't want to fit in there very well. So what I like to do is disconnect your upper control arm, so that way you can tip the hub out and push the CV shaft in, and it'll get you a little more access there. And that's an 18 mil ratcheting wrench. Just make sure it's about finger tight there. And then we're gonna hit there with a hammer and it'll dislocate. Now you can take your hammer and you're gonna wanna hit on the knuckle. Try not to hit the control arm. And it'll pop apart like that. Now you can push in on the CV and that gives you more access to those bolts. Grab your 21. And then turn the knuckle the other way, get your other two. Then you might have to tap on the wheel bearing. Just kind of work it back and forth. And when you take your wheel bearing out, you'll notice one of the O-rings comes out. That usually sits about here. And then there's a second O-ring in there. So grab a screwdriver and be careful because we're gonna reuse these O-rings. Just kind of walk it out and save these. Now you can grab your 24 millimeter socket and take off your lower nut. And once again, just barely leave it on there. Grab your hammer. You're gonna tap on the knuckle. It'll drop down, take your nut off, remove your knuckle. So now we're gonna take out our CV axle. I always like to take a paint pen and mark on the axle and the flange. So that way later when you put it back together, you have the same orientation of it. And then you grab your 17 millimeter socket with an extension. And you take out all 8 of your bolts. All right, now that you got your bolts out, you can slide it past this bump stop and remove your CV axle. Now you can grab your 21 wrench and your 21 mil socket and remove that lower shock bolt. Now you can grab your 21 ratcheting wrench and take off the nuts on top of your shock. Then you can remove your shock. Now we're going to take out our lower control arm. We've got a 24 millimeter wrench and a 21 millimeter socket. Be careful when you loosen the second bolt, so this control arm is going to swing down. And you're going to want to save the hardware because we're going to reuse it later. Now we can remove our bump stops. You're only going to remove the front one, you're going to leave the back one in place. I find it easiest to grab a hammer, just kind of hit them, then they'll pop out. All right, and now before we remove the front drive shaft, make sure to take a paint pen and mark on the cap and then on the flange, so that way when you put it back together, it's indexed the same way. Now you can grab your 11 mil socket. Then grab a pry bar. You can get in between here, pop the drive shaft apart. Be careful that your caps don't slide off. So now we're going to grab an 18 millimeter socket and wrench, and we're going to take out our bolts for our crossmember. And you can throw away the crossmember and the bolts. We're not going to reuse these. All right, so now we're going to start taking the front diff out. First, you're going to disconnect this electrical connector. You got to slide that red clip back, then push down on the back of it. And it'll come apart. And then you've got Christmas tree clips to take out, which helps with your trim tool. And then once you have those off, on top, it's kind of hard to see. You just feel around, there's a breather hose up there. You're just gonna pull on that and pop it off the top of the diff. So we'll start with our first diff bolt here. You can see the bottom of it hanging through the diff. It's kind of hard to get to on the top side, but it's an 18 millimeter. If you get a ratcheting wrench in there. Now you can grab your 18 mil socket and take the next bolt out. So now you're going to want to support your diff with a jack. Then you can take out your other bolt here. It's a 15 mil socket. Now you can grab your 21 millimeter and take off the two nuts over here. And just put a hand on it to make sure it doesn't go anywhere. So now that you have all your bolts out, you can carefully lower the jack. And as it comes down, you might have to move it to the passenger side a little bit to clear this control arm pocket. So now we're going to get to the part where we're going to have to cut the crossmember pockets for our new crossmember. And the GM frames come with a lot of this. It's really sticky and just gross coating to prevent for rust. Just finish that off with some brake clean and a couple more rags, and that'll give you a nice clean surface to mark your lines and do your cutting. I like to put a trash can under it so you don't ruin your nice shop floor. So now that you've got the part cleaned, you're going to measure from the center of the hole on the front side 1.25 inches. You're going to make a mark, and you're going to bring that line all the way down as straight as possible. And then on the back side, you're going to do the same, but the measurement on the back side is 2.5 inches. All right, so now that we've got our lines drawn, we can cut the part. You can do this in a couple different ways. You can either use a cutoff wheel or a Sawzall. In our case, we have a plasma cutter. Just if you don't feel comfortable doing this, you can get a professional to cut it. All right, now that we got our part cut, we're just gonna go ahead and grind up any sharp edges we left, and then we're gonna touch it up with paint. Now we can assemble our new diff drop bracket. I like to take and put a little bit of grease on the bushings before you put them in. And those just slide into the new bracket. Then you got your new sleeve, a little bit of grease on that too. And you might have to tap on it with a hammer just to get it fully seated in there. And just make sure it's about the same on both sides. So now we're going to remove these 4 factory bolts so our bracket can go on. And we supply new bolts. You're going to want to make sure to put a little bit of Loctite on each bolt. And then grab your 17 mil and tighten these down. Now we're going to install our diff drop brackets. The passenger side only has 1 gusset and the driver's side has 2. So we'll start off with the passenger side, and you're going to want the small end of the taper to the rear of the vehicle. Put that on those studs and then use the factory hardware. Now we can install our driver's side drop bracket. We supply new hardware. Make sure to put a little bit of thread locker on those. And then grab a 21 mil socket, and these holes line up pretty well where you can use a 3/8 extension. So So you have new hardware to install the front differential, and on the driver's side you're going to use these 3.5-inch bolts, and then on the passenger side you're going to use these 1.5-inch bolts with these thick washers. All right, so now you're going to grab a buddy and we're going to lift this up onto the jack. Now that you've got it close, grab your new hardware. So now grab a 19mm socket and wrench and snug up your hardware, but do not tighten it. After you make your cut on your control arm pocket, as you can see, we've got our diff back in. It gets really close right there. So you're going to take this corner off, and obviously you'll do this before the diff is in. And then on the other side, it's also close right here. So without the diff in, you're going to measure about 4 1/4 and make a mark, and then just bring it up into this bend, make a mark there, and you'll take a burr bit and just open it up a little bit. Now we can install our rear cross member. It has these tabs that go on to this diff bracket. Those go forward. It's going to fit really snug on that. You run your bolts from the rear to the front. And then install your supplied bolt into that bracket we put on the diff. Goes from the passenger side to the driver with your new washer and nut. Now that you have your cross member in, you can fully tighten those differential bolts. Once again, that's a 19 on the top and bottom. Now grab a 22 wrench and a 21 socket, and you can tighten up this bolt for the diff bracket. Now we can reconnect our front differential wiring. Make sure you push that red clip back in. And then our breather hose, pull that back down. And then we supply a couple zip ties so you can zip tie this to the front differential. I like to use this hole here on the top of the diff. And I like to put another one around the actuator. Then just cut off the remainder. And with that breather hose, if it doesn't reach, you can just pull on it and gain a little more slack. It'll slide down a little bit. Just make sure it's not too tight on there where it's going to pop itself back off. Now we're going to reinstall the front drive shaft. Using our OE hardware, I like to put a little bit of thread locker on the bolts just to make sure they're not going to come back out on you. And make sure you line up that mark you made earlier with the mark on the pinion flange. And you can tighten those back down with your 11mm socket. So now you can grab your new cross member, and it's got this taper here. Make sure that goes forward. And you're going to reuse your factory hardware. And we're going to leave these loose until you get your lower control arms on, along with these ones back here are also loose. So now we can install our new drop brackets on our control arm. And it comes with these shims. The one with the groove on it goes to the rear of the control arm. They just slide in the factory torsion bar hole. Then your new bracket will slide over, just hold those in. Then take your new bolt and run it from the front to the rear. Your washer and nut. And just, now you're going to reuse your factory bolt here. And we're going to leave this hardware loose until we have it fully installed. Now we can put our control arm in. And the longer bolt goes in the rear, the shorter bolt will go in the front. All right, now we're going to assemble our new Fox shocks. And they come in this bag. I like to just rip the top and stick the eyelet through. until it's fully installed in the vehicle. That way you don't scratch up your nice shock. You're gonna wanna take the bushing and put a little bit of oil or lube of some sort on there. And press it together. And make sure it's centered. And then your eyelet goes through the top on this one. Just make sure it's got the same amount on each side. Now we can do the other end. Once again, make sure it's centered. And you're good to go. Now we can install our shock with our new provided hardware. Bring the control arm up. And just line up your shock with that bracket. We're going to leave this bolt loose until it's on the ground, but we can tighten our upper bolts. All right, now we can tighten this lower bolt that we installed earlier. Your shock bolt you're still going to leave loose until it's on the ground. It is a 21mm wrench and socket. All right, so now get out the biggest socket you have and tighten this lower bolt. It is a 38 on the front, and then the back side is 1 7/16 inches. So now we can go to installing our skid plates. As you can see, we've got 3 different ones. We're gonna start off with this one, and we supply new bolts for these skid plates in the bottom of this one. These 2 upper holes, you're gonna reuse your factory bolts. And make sure to put a little bit of Loctite on all these. And these are all part of that multi-point structure. We'll start off with this one first. As you can see, it's got a bend in it, and that'll go forward. Get your rear bolt started. And that'll hold it in place. Then we can go to this one next. Now we can take those 2 factory bolts and get your front one started. Then the rear one goes underneath of this new one. You're gonna wanna get both of them up there. You can grab your socket. It's a 19mm. Just go over them one more time, which is a 15mm. Tighten your 2 factory bolts. So now that we have our skid plates on, we can install our new badge. We leave these off for you to put on, so that way if you wanted to powder coat these or paint them to the color of your truck, you can. Now we're going to start the process of getting our knuckle ready to install. The first thing we need to do is trim our factory dust shield. And I found it easiest if you just set it on there and line it up. And as you can see, your bolts won't go through for your caliper. So what you're going to do is you're going to get a paint pen and you're just going to mark a line straight down from here. You're just going to bring it down, and once you cut that, it'll allow this to be accessed. As you can see, now you have access to these bolts. Now we're going to install our O-rings that we saved from earlier into our new knuckle. As you can see, there's a slot down here that this one's going to go into. Just work it around until it's flush all the way around. And then this top rim is where the next one goes. And then you're going to want to put a little bit of grease on these, so that way the wheel bearing slides in easily. Make sure to get both O-rings. That'll prevent these from ripping when you put the wheel bearing in. Now you can set your dust shield on the wheel bearing. And sometimes you'll get lucky and this O-ring will stay on there when you try and put the knuckle onto the wheel bearing. but sometimes you might have to just put it on the wheel bearing first. That might be easier. Then you can put your knuckle on. Once you get that lined up, put a little bit of Loctite on your bolts. You're going to reuse your factory bolts for this. You might have to move it around just to get them started, because you do not want to cross thread these. Now you can grab your 21mm socket and go in a star pattern and tighten these up. Now don't be like us and forget to put your sensor in before you put the wheel bearing together, because the backing plate hits it. So put that in when you're putting the knuckle together. Once again, this is a 10mm to tighten this sensor. With everything installed, now we can install the knuckle on the truck. And then grab your 24mm socket and tighten up that lower nut. Now we can install our CV axle. You're going to reuse your factory bolts. You're going to want to make sure the snout of the CV axle goes into the wheel bearing. Then you can push this over into place. And remember those lines that we put on here earlier, make sure you line those up with the CV. Then after you get all your bolts in, it's an 18mm socket, and you can go around and tighten these up. Now we can hook our knuckle back up to our upper control arm. And that CV might want to fight you a little bit. You might have to turn it just a little bit to get it to slide together, but once you do, it'll go through. Then you can tilt it up, lower your arm into the knuckle, and then put the nut back on. Then grab your 18mm, tighten that nut down. As you can see, the shank is spinning on it, so you might have to put a pry bar on top and put a little down pressure on that, because that is tapered. Then you can tighten it down. Now we can install our hub nut. Then once again, your 36mm socket. Now reinstall the factory bracket with that factory bolt. There's also a 10mm socket. Then you can reconnect your ABS line. And make sure to push that red clip back in and put that back on the frame. We supply these clamps and bolts, but first I like to take a pair of side cutters and take off these old Christmas tree clips just to clean it up in here a little bit. You can grab your new clamps, put those around there, and there's a couple locations on the back of the knuckle that it's already threaded, and these bolts will just thread right in. Then you grab your 11mm socket. Once you get this, you don't want to have it too tight on here where it's going to rub. And just tighten this one down, and then your next one is up here. And then it should look like that when it's done. It's all nice and tight. It's not going to rub on anything. Now we can reinstall our rotor. Make sure to line up that tapered hole with the threaded hole in the wheel bearing itself. Then you can grab your T30 and reinstall that mounting bolt. So now we can reinstall our caliper. You put your factory bolts back in. And then tighten those up with your 21mm socket. Grab our 18mm ratcheting wrench and take off our factory sway bar link. The center of it does start to spin. Grab some vice grips. Just put that on the center. You can ratchet it off then. Now it's time to put the sway bar links on. We have two different sleeves here. The shorter sleeve will go on the top, Then the longer sleeve will go in the bottom. And then that space there, we have this bushing that goes on. The longer bolt goes in the bottom, the shorter one in the top. The one with that bushing goes on the bottom against the control arm. The other one goes up top. Then just push up on your sway bar, line that up. And then tighten those down. With a 19mm socket and wrench, now you can grab your Milwaukee grease gun and make sure to grease these. Now we're going to reconnect our factory tie rod. And previously it came up, but with our new knuckle, the taper is the opposite direction. So that way you have a better angle on your inner tie rod. So all you got to do is just spin that, and then it'll go right together. There's a 21mm socket. You can tighten that down. Before we can put our torsion bars back in, we're going to have to clearance the factory cross member. Just in this corner here, make a couple marks, and you're going to take a 1/4 inch of material out. You're going to do that on both sides of the vehicle. And this is on the front half of the cross member. And we're using a burr bit for this. It might take a little bit because it's a thick material, but just keep working at it and get a nice clean edge, and then go through and paint it after you're done. So now before we install our torsion bars, I like to put a little bit of grease on these new brackets, just to make sure the torsion bars slide in nice and easy. And that way if you ever have to take them back apart, they're going to come back apart. So now we can install our torsion bar, and just make sure you have the correct side like you marked earlier, and clock it in the same position as it came out. Now we can reinstall our factory cross member. We're reusing the factory hardware for this. Now you can tighten those 2 bolts down with a 21mm socket. Now we can grab our factory torsion keys, and we have these new brackets to go on here, and you make sure you can see how it's got a taper there. That's going to go back. Just go on there and then tap it into place. Just make sure it's seated on there. Nice. We do that to both sides. Once those are on there, you'll grab your appropriate side that you're working on. Slide that up in there, then slide your bar back. You might have to wiggle it around to get your bar fully seated. If it doesn't want to go in all the way, you can tap on the front of the bar with a hammer just to get it fully seated in there. And then you're ready to put your adjuster back in. So now that we have the torsion bar key tool installed, we can go ahead and run that up. And you want to just run that up enough so you can fit your adjuster in there. Then once your adjuster's in there and centered with the key, you can go ahead and take that tool back off. And once you get the tool off, you can put your bolt back in there. And then run that back up to the measurement that you previously measured before you had the lift on. And that'll be a good start. Now we're going to go ahead and tighten up our crossmember bolts. We're going to tighten up the top ones, but leave the lower ones loose. You're going to need a 24mm wrench, a 21mm socket. So now we can get to the portion of installing our new brake lines. First, we're gonna have to get our 10mm socket. Take this bracket off here. Save that bolt. And that'll gain access to this clip on the back side, so you can release the line. But while that line is still in there, I like to take your 1/2 inch and break that free. And just leave it snug so it's not gonna leak on you. And then you can take that clip out. Usually with a pair of side cutters, you can just grab onto that lip and kind of wiggle it out. And that'll release the line. And then I like to take a pair of vice grips and just put it on the line here at the bottom. So that way it's not leaking everywhere while you're working on it. Now grab your 7/16. Take out your banjo bolt. And then the old washer might get stuck on there. So you can take some pliers, just grab a hold of that, and then unthread it. Make sure to save your bolt. And we supply new copper washers. Just get that old one off there. And make sure to put your new ones on there. Make sure your washer's on there. Install that through. Put yours on the back side. And you'll see it's got that recess where the bolt goes in. And then they are side specific. As you can see, it tapers away from the caliper, so that way you have clearance here. Just get that started. Tighten it down. You can let that hang there. Now you can take this completely off. You might have to put some pliers on there to hold the line. All right, now remove your old line. Now just route your new one up through. Make sure it isn't kinked or twisted. Might take a minute to get it lined up perfect. They are fine threads, so make sure you don't cross thread them. Just put your 18mm wrench on there and then tighten that down. And I want to make sure you get it good and tight so it's not going to leak. Now that your line's tightened up, you can put your new clip in. Just make sure your line's pushed up in. You might have to move it around a little bit to get it fully seated in there. Then your new clip will go into the slot. You might need channel locks to get this in there. Sometimes you can hit it with a hammer, but I found it easiest to use the channel locks. It's gonna be a nice tight fit. Just work it back and forth until it's on there. Now that your line's tight and all secure, make sure to take some brake clean and just clean off all the brake fluid that was on there. Now we can grab our new retainer and our new bolt and attach that line to the back of your knuckle. Just put it around there, clamp it down, and there's a bolt hole right here. That is a 7/16 socket. And then get your second bolt and clamp started down here. And then you can tighten that down. Now we can reinstall our bracket here with that factory bolt again. And grab your 10mm and tighten that down. Now that your new lines are on, don't forget to bleed your brakes. So now we can move on to the rear. We're going to start off by taking the bolts out of this bracket here. There's one here and there's two on the back. They're 13mm. Right here and right here. Also a 13mm. That'll allow slack on these lines for when you lower the rear end down. Next, you're going to take off these two nuts on the diff cover. Also a 13. And just pull that off that stud, and that'll allow slack for when you lower that down also. Now we can grab our 21mm socket and wrench and remove our rear shock. Make sure you have the axle supported with a jack. We're gonna save this hardware and reuse it later. It's also a 21 on the top. It's kind of hard to get around the exhaust here. Now we can grab our 27mm socket and take off our nuts for the U-bolts. Now we can remove the factory U-bolts. And then we're going to lower down the axle. Lower it down just enough to gain access so we can put our new block in. And while you're lowering it, keep checking to make sure you're not pulling on anything super tight. So now we can install our new block. You make sure that the bump stop wing faces inward of the axle and the smaller portion of the taper is facing forward. It's got 2 holes. You're going to put the pin in the rearmost hole. If you don't have it down low enough, just lower it a little more. I like to line up the bottom one first, then you can raise it back up. You might have to push in on the spring or shift the axle to get those to line up. So if it doesn't want to line up like ours is, you're going to go ahead and loosen the other side U-bolts just a little bit. You're not going to take them completely off. Just loosen them a couple turns. And that'll allow you to shift that axle around. Put a little pressure on it. It should fall right in place. So now we can install our new U-bolts. These ones are longer to compensate for that block. And once you torque U-bolts, they stretch. So you're gonna wanna replace them every time you take them apart. Just make sure they go in between these lines and you're not hooked on anything. And then they sit in these divots up top on this plate. Just make sure they sit into that divot. Those also come with new nuts. And you're gonna reuse your lower retaining plate. And then grab your 1 1/8" socket. You can tighten these down. Now we can install our bushings and our new shocks. Just put a little bit of lube on there. And then just press these in. Just make sure it's centered. And then you can press your sleeve in. And you just have to take your band off and they're ready to install. Now grab your factory hardware and install your shock. You might have to compress it to get it to line up. And we'll tighten these bolts when it's on the ground. Now we can install our new relocate bracket for the brake line. I find it easiest to bolt it to the existing bracket first, and then you can bend it around to line up those studs. Just get those started and leave them loose for now. Get it lined up on those studs. Then you use your 2 factory nuts. Those are a 13 mil. You can tighten those down. And then the new ones up top are also a 13 on the back and the front. Now for our next bracket, we need to take a trim tool, pop this wiring harness out. It's in there pretty good. Once you get that out, then there's another one here that's on this stud. Just pop that off. Then you can get your 10 mil in there to take those 2 bolts out on either side. Now we can install our new bracket. Use the factory hardware on this side of it. And make sure to run the bolt from the bottom. Tighten that down again. Then you can bolt this bracket back to the axle. And to gain enough slack to get that bracket over to bolt it back up, you might have to take these out. And then you can run those under for the time being. And then use your factory hardware on here. And then use a 13 mil to tighten these factory bolts back down. The back ones you can use a socket on. This one with this new bracket in here, it's kind of tight. So you just use a wrench on this side. Now we can grab our new hardware, line this bracket up. That is 11 mil wrench and 11 mil socket. You tighten those down. And then we supply a zip tie to tie these 2 harnesses back up. Now you can take your bags off your shocks, and then once you get your wheels and tires on it, get it on the ground and you can tighten everything up. Now that you've got everything installed, put your wheels and tires on. You're gonna have to tighten everything up on the ground and then send it off to alignment. This video is just a visual guide on how to install things. Still follow your paper instructions. Stay up to date with everything we've got going on our social media. Till then, see you next time.